Without further ado, I think I would like to give the floor to our first presenters. So basically having Crowley and Catherine Jones from Coventry University. So the floor is yours now, and you have about 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation. I will stop sharing my screen, and accordingly you can start to share your screen, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for organising this event and the opportunity to be here with you all this evening. Let me just start the slides. Hopefully you can see that. Good, that's always that first moment of anxiety. Always nice to see the thumbs up, so thank you. Yes, as Oscar said, we are going to be just speaking briefly to the paper in the special issue tonight, which is called Beyond Here and There, Reconceptualizing Migrant Journeys in the In-Between. And I will be speaking for 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll hand over to my colleague Catherine Jones to pick up some of the points in the article. I mean, obviously we have a very limited amount of time to go into depth, so I hope people have been able to sort of read the empirical material, because this is really at the heart of our work. This is one of many papers coming out of the MEDNIC project, which essentially collected data from people arriving in Europe at the end of 2015. So over the course of about 3 or 4 months, we collected something like 600 interviews, 500 of which were with migrants and refugees themselves about their experiences and their journeys and their trajectories. And I think what was clear from that material, and what becomes clear, I hope, in the article, is that one of the very significant issues that underpins a lot of discussion around journeys of one kind or another, trajectories, physical and otherwise, is the perspective from which those journeys are understood. And I think very much in terms of our research and the view from Europe, it was very clear that not just in Europe, but elsewhere, there is this tendency to view the journeys of migrants and refugees in a very linear way, as being between two places, here and there. And so this notion of the in-between is basically the places where people are stuck or in transit. And it's one that reflects and reinforces a particular conceptualization of people as being constantly on the move. So the bit that happens between here and there is often dismissed as simply being a stepping stone to another place. It's an in-between place that's not of kind of note or significance in terms of understanding. But what we argue in the paper is that such representations of the in-between ignore the very complex social and economic and, of course, political realities that are associated with migrant decision-making, as well as the scale and the direction of migration flows. And nowhere, in a way, is this more evident than in representations of the journeys of those who arrived in Europe during the so-called migration crisis of 2015. And I think it's very clear that, and I had lots of images that I wanted to show you of this, I'm sure they're familiar to you, we don't have time, but this discussion of the crisis, which of course has been unpacked elsewhere, gave the impression of this linear, uninterrupted flow of people heading towards Europe, and often represented in the media and in policy discussions indeed as being sort of straight arrows between two distinct areas on a map, ignoring the in-between as being inconsequential somehow in those processes. And I think many of us as researchers have often tended to focus on either the things that happen to people that lead them to leave their countries of origin, or what happens to them when they arrive somewhere. But of course, that point of arrival is only a point in a person's trajectory. It isn't necessarily the destination or the end point. It's part of the story, and often the part of the story where we as researchers come in and capture a sort of snapshot of someone's interpretation of those experiences at that moment. So the paper basically, we undertook around 500 interviews with a huge range of different people. But this paper, we've decided to focus in on 3 particular groups: Syrians, Nigerians, and Afghans, all of whom had spent considerable periods of time in other places that might have been there had we have interviewed them in those places. In this case, Turkey for the Syrians. Many of the Nigerians had spent time in Libya and intended to be there in the first place. And we met many Afghans from Iran, some of whom had been born there, many of whom had lived there for decades. And then they came into contact with us, the researchers in Europe. And that, of course, then became it became the point at which we engaged with them. And Catherine's going to talk more about the consequences of that conceptualization in terms of the kind of the politics of this and the policy of this and why it matters. But I just wanted to say something before I hand over to her about the politics of all of this, because for me, the way in which the in-between is conceptualized and is absent often from an interpretation or understanding of journeys is deeply political, like all aspects of migration research. And it has huge implications, not just for policy and research, but actually between the two, because we talk often about, policy-based evidence-making or evidence-based policy-making. And we see that this notion of, for example, transit migration, which is very widely written about and started off very much as a sort of academic policy concept, has very much been mobilized for political purposes. And it's often been associated with increased securitization rather than increased rights because of the assumption about onward movement that comes from this notion of transit. And I think for us too as researchers, it's really important to understand how the design of the research, the questions that we ask, the location of the fieldwork also significantly shapes understandings of migrant journeys. It's important that we ourselves don't reinforce the notion of start and end points on a journey in the ways in which we gather the data, analyze the data, and write about processes of mobility, not least because immobility, and I think others will be talking about that and write about that in their own papers, is equally significant and sometimes more so. And so when you think about, the kind of decision-making process, decisions to move on from a place are often associated with inequalities in that place rather than an intention to move onwards at the outset of a journey. So inequalities in access to protection and rights, opportunities to work, opportunities to be educated. And what's clear from our material, and I hope is clear from the paper, that place matters. That these were not just stepping stones or places in the in-between. They were actually places where people lived and had lives. They had families, they had jobs, they had homes in all of the places through which they passed en route seemingly to Europe, but often not intending them to be places of en route whilst they were there. And actually what we see in a lot of the material, not surprisingly given that we do it in our own lives, is that people make sense of those journeys, those physical journeys, but also those sort of psychological or emotional journeys at different parts of this process. So when people come somewhere like in, for example, Italy or Turkey or Malta or Greece, where we interviewed them, they have a narrative account of that story and how they arrived there as a way of making sense of the life in which they are currently living. It's not necessarily a reflection of the journey as it was experienced. And we as researchers often kind of reinforce that by focusing on the fact that they've ended up where they have, not on the places where they actually spent quite often a lot of time. So I'll hand over to Catherine, who'll talk about some of why this matters in our view.
Great, thanks very much, Heaven, for that. And we were asked in the session to address the issue of policy implications. And before we do that, we thought it was worthwhile talking about some of the implications for methodological considerations. So the political underpinnings of methodological considerations, if you like. And it's worth kind of mentioning at this point that our research was funded by the UK government, which asked very specific research questions of all of the projects that were funded in that particular round, many of which could be summarised as why are all these migrants coming to Europe? In other words, the research right from the beginning was set up as not a neutral question. The questions were framed by a particular policy narrative. So when we think about policy implications, it's not something that we should only think about at the end of a research. It's something that we should think about in terms of how we actually devise the research as well. And as Heaven already mentioned, as researchers, it's really incumbent on us to ensure that we weren't, however, inadvertently fueling different sets of assumptions, discourses, and narratives. So in this particular project, we approached migration in thinking about it as an ontological category rather than only a simple physical, geographical, linear process. And that was really important because it allowed us then to ask people about their experiences and feelings about the places they were in at that particular time. And so if we don't do that and we only ask about people's physical journeys using questions which are framed by European policymakers or informed by that kind of narrative and discourse, then we're actually going to silence people's very real and very valuable experiences. So as Heaven already mentioned, Nigerians who were in Libya talked about their everyday experiences there, which included falling in love, getting married. And people who were living in Turkey talked about going shopping, everyday matters of getting their kids into school. And if we only ask about the physical journeys, then we miss all of these really valuable experiences which people have. And then rethinking the in-between challenges to think very carefully about the people with whom we choose to conduct our research, including how we define and categorize responses, the questions we ask, and the implications of where we actually ask them. So this speaks to the point of not assuming that where you interview somebody is actually the end point on their journeys. Their journey may be far more meaningful in a physical sense as well as in a more ontological, metaphorical sense as well. And then the decisions to actually move are often made contingent on what is going on in a place at a particular time. And if we frame our research questions and devise our research methodologies building on European policymakers' discourse and assuming that people are wanting to just come to Europe, then we can't really understand and we completely miss all of the factors in those places, including, for example, in our case, in our paper, we highlight that the situation in Iran had changed very dramatically over a course of the last few years prior to 2015. In Turkey, the context changed, and it was these factors which informed people's reasons and decisions to move on. And then, of course, those factors can't be understood without understanding the wider context. Those factors don't happen in a vacuum. What was happening in Libya doesn't happen only in Libya. It's a result of what's happening elsewhere. And as researchers, if we're only looking at policymakers' questions and not thinking more critically about how we devise our research, then we inadvertently end up playing into prevailing anti-migrant and even racist European discourses. There. So next slide, please, Heaven. So implications for policy. And I suppose the first thing I'd say here is whose policy are we thinking about here? We assumed for this session we were probably thinking about European policy, but of course, you know, policy might be relative to any other context in which we were conducting the research and for where people have come as well. But bearing that in mind, if we're thinking purely about European policy, then for us, the implications of our research and particularly of the paper, which we included in the special issue, is that there is a need to pay more attention to the drivers of forced migration, particularly including addressing structural inequalities, so political inequalities, socio-economic inequalities, and other types of inequalities as well. There's also a need to look at the insufficient reception conditions and the lack of rights in countries neighbouring the EU, which were very prevalent at that time, particularly looking at Turkey and Libya, but also Lebanon, Jordan and Iran as well. And then secondly, obviously and quite clearly, and I'm sure others will mention it as well, there's clearly a need to provide access to adequate reception and protection facilities, and that includes access to refugeehood, and that shouldn't only be determined on the basis of nationality alone. Individuals should be allowed to go through asylum processes, and the rights of those who aren't regarded under the UNHCR Convention shouldn't be effectively disregarded as a result of that. Thirdly, and further policy implication is that there is a clear, really driving need to look at increasing access to safe and legal routes for protection when those are actually needed. During the time we were conducting the research, during the time we were writing the paper, and of course currently there's an overwhelming focus by European policymakers on smashing the smuggling business model and so on, but that ignores all the rationale for actually looking at safe and legal routes for protection. So this might be resettlement, might be humanitarian visas, maybe temporary protection, family reunification, but also there's a need to think more creatively about alternative pathways, but such as through labour migration routes as well. We also clearly need to move beyond the politics of containment on the part of European policymakers. The overwhelming policy towards North Africa has been securitization of the Mediterranean and the militarization of the Mediterranean. Yet actually we know, and it's very clear evidence, that that will make the problem worse, and it certainly leads to more deaths and really hinders the rights of individuals who need to move. And as part of that as well, we've seen an increasing move on the part of European policymakers towards using development as a way of trying to stem migration to Europe. And actually that is really harmful. And so we would like to highlight the implication that we really should be looking more at rights-based development, including development which specifically addresses those structural inequalities which you mentioned earlier. So that's it, and we'll pause there. I think we've reached our 10-12 minutes, so thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions. You can see on that slide, we do still have a website, and if there's any further information you'd like beyond what was in the paper, then there are other pieces of information on that website there.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was, as expected, inspiring and very comprehensive in a very short period of time. Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to move to Turkey virtually. So I would like to give the floor to Ahmet İçduygu from Koç University to talk more about smuggling issues, actually. Yeah, the floor is yours, Ahmet. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Özge. Good evening to everyone. Actually, my paper, the title, Decentering Migrant Smuggling, Reflections on the Eastern Mediterranean Route to Europe, indeed is very complementary to the previous presentation, previous paper. I will also focus on the journeys going through the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe, but my focus will be on smuggling issues. Let me start. Actually, my article starts by referring to difference between two generations of scholarship on migrant smuggling. Just I refer to the first generation of research on migrant smuggling, just developed 1990s and to 2000s. In fact, the focus was mostly quite state-centric focus we observe, and the focus goes on to the criminality issues related to migrant smuggling. Then 2000s, in fact, at 2010s, I call it a kind of second generation research on migrant smuggling. Focus moves to mostly to the migrants and smuggler relationship and the larger context of the smuggling activities. I call it a kind of decentering attempt in scholarship. In fact, my paper also contributes to this second generation research. At the beginning of the paper, I referred to the issue of framing what I call the quote-unquote reality, and I referred to, for instance, in the Cold War period, there was a concept of humanitarian smuggling, just focusing on the people escaping from the authoritarian communist regimes to Western world. And at that time, the smugglers used to be seen as a kind of humanitarian actors rather than criminals. But now we moved to the kind of criminality based approach from that stage. And in this article, I focus on the Eastern Mediterranean region, particularly focusing on Turkey as a transit country and the destination country. And I like to just try to go deep into what's behind migrant smuggling. Just let me first talk about the case here. Again, I argue that the geography and history matter here, but I argue that in fact the smuggling and these irregular flows in the region has a long history. In the previous paper, just referred to the events of 2015 summer and fall, and in fact in that period and in the following period, there were hot debates on the smuggling issues. And in this paper, I argue that it is smuggling in the region and the debate around the smuggling in the region and even the theorizing on smuggling is not something new. If it is a kind of history of the last 3 decades. The region, actually, where I refer to the Eastern Mediterranean route to Europe, Turkey is at the center. This we can consider as a kind of periphery of the Europe and the connecting to Asia, Africa, and Middle East through a corridor and the flows of people, journeys of different types of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Just in the paper, I referred a bit to history going back to the early 1990s. The political changes in Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq, and recently Syria. In fact, though, this political history of the neighborhood contributed heavily to these flows from a kind of structural perspective. And almost there is a kind of migratory corridor in the region, a kind of transnational space, I argue, where both the migrants and smugglers get together. And of course, I focus on the role of migrant smuggling particularly in the influx of the refugees. I will come to that point later. So what I argue that there's a kind of historical and structural picture behind the smuggling in the region. On the one hand, all the restrictive migration and asylum policies in Europe. On the other hand, there's a kind of migratory push from these countries I mentioned, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So there's no legal channels of migration, and there are also very restrictive channels of the asylum policies. Then the result is the smuggling becoming very functional for the people to take them from one location to another. In fact, the data for this paper coming from various research since the early 2000s, I heavily focus on the smuggling issue, and some of the research I conducted in Turkey funded by the IUM, then there were FP7 project in the 2014-17, and also another Horizon project. So I collected so many narratives, not only from the migrants themselves, but also from smugglers and the border guards. So actually in this paper, there are so many narratives coming actually from the main actors of this smuggling activities. So at the macro level, in fact, here I ask in this paper 2 main questions. At the macro level, I like to I focus on how does migrant smuggling respond to the vulnerabilities created by the strict immigration policies and the border closures over time, and to produce its own well-functioning shadow infrastructure, how the smuggling developed in itself as a product of the historical and structural context. Then at the micro level, I look at how the main actors of smuggling, these are the facilitators, migrants themselves, or the asylum seekers, refugees, in fact, their families, friends, and the communities together, how they arrange the smuggling process. In fact, this is quite different from how the state portrayed the smuggling. Then let me go to I will highlight some points actually I made in the paper. I already mentioned that there's a long discussion on this macro level structure, talking about a kind of so-called root causes. I refer to long history of the so-called fragile and weak states, as I refer to Afghanistan, Iran, or Iraq, and now recently Syria. What I argue that in fact, at the micro level, this smuggling activity is quite complex and a multi-actor phenomena, and deeply subjective, involving many actors, and those several actors develop their own strategies. In the earlier literature, there is this, when we discussed smugglers versus migrants, often we visualize the migrants as a victims, and in fact, what this research narrative shows that it's also a kind of questionable to portraying them as always victims. In fact, they are quite active, and they are taking active roles. And the trust issue between migrants and smugglers, this is earlier, in the earlier literature also debated, and my findings also, this is very essential, how the smuggling operates through the trust established between the smugglers and migrants. Another kind of cliche view on the smuggling issue, seeing it as a criminal activity in the hands of big mafia criminal groups. Also, I argue that through these narratives, actually, it's quite complex process, a kind of interaction between the migrant or refugees asylum themselves, their families, relatives, and the friends, communities. In fact, in a kind of transnational space, not just ranging from the Afghanistan to Iran, then Turkey to various European countries. There's a kind of network. Through these networks, in fact, the smuggling operates. I refer to a bit the distinction between these irregular migrants and refugees, particularly arguing that, in fact, these quite restrictive policies on asylum issues. Often the smuggling becomes the only tool for the refugees to move from one place to another, although we criminalize the smuggling issues. How the smuggling itself perceived by the refugees and migrants is quite different from how the brokers classify the different migration categories. So I argue that in fact, the migrants and refugees produce a collective system of migratory knowledge, and through that they contribute to the formation of transnational space, and they use this space to move from one place to another. Also, I argue that the smuggling becomes a kind of a tool for the refugee protection. Finally, I'm coming to the a bit conclusion actually posed by by Özge, actually, in the context of this webinar. The first thing is that if we look at whether journeys are linear or unidirectional movement from origin to destination, or they move as the step by step. In fact, the migrant smuggling is a kind of good tool to answer this process. I argue that the smuggling activities are both causes and consequences of the step by step process. Secondly, I already mentioned that who are the main actors reshaping the migration trajectories. Here, what is probably significant again, that referring to these complex networks of the different actors, exchanges between these actors, they are very important. How the migration, how the smuggling process just progress. I also refer to to better understand smuggling activities. In fact, we have to refer to how the migrants and the smugglers and the other agents in the transnational spaces and through the networks they operate. The final slide, actually. This is a very general comment, but in terms of the policy implications, particularly referring to again asylum system and the in fact, in the absence of the regular, orderly, and legitimate border crossings, what I argue that the smuggling becomes really a kind of functional, particularly which again I stress that this is very important for the asylum, in the case of asylum seekers. If we approach the whole process from the criminal aspect, in fact, what this also works against the asylum seeking process. Methodologically, in fact, I will argue that both theorizing and the conducting research on decision-making process of most potential migrants who live in an environment of uncertainty and insecurities, this is quite significantly important actually probably for our research agenda, just to go deep doing research on the decision-making process, particularly in the environment of uncertainties and insecurities, where we, in fact, the case I am focusing on, particularly irregular migrants and the refugees. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. Yeah, so I think one of the strengths of this special was to really get such in-depth ethnographic work together. And having said that, I would like to now move forward to Katie's presentation from Katie Krushmander from Maastricht University, who will talk about Eritrean and Nigerian migration journeys. Katie, just to let you know, I will send a private chat message to you after 9 minutes of your presentation. Okay?
Great.
Yeah. Floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Ozge. And thanks very much for organizing this webinar to highlight the special issue. It's great to be here. My paper is more of an empirical paper that focuses on the experiences of Eritrean and Nigerian migrants' journeys to Europe. And it's called Before Disembarkation, because here I really look at their experiences and journeys before they get on the boats to cross the Mediterranean. This work that I'm presenting today was conducted as part of an NVO Rubicon grant that I received a few years ago and was completed at the European University Institute from 2016 to 2018. So the starting point of this entire project was sort of maps like these that of course give a really unrealistic view of what's happening. And when there's just this sort of one arrow that summarizes migrants coming from the central Mediterranean route. And I think that already we've had great presentations that start to show that, of course, this is really, there's much more happening behind this. And as academics and researchers, we know that there's many more complicated flows and experiences and routes and journeys being taken by migrants as they travel towards Europe. This is just one example of, I think, the various routes people take across Africa. I focused on Nigerians and Eritreans because from 2014 to 2017, there were two of the largest groups of arrivals coming to Italy. And within that time period, there were almost 200,000 Eritreans and Nigerians arriving in Italy irregularly. So there was quite a large number of migrants coming from these two countries. And of course, these are very different countries. They're located on different parts clearly of Africa, but they also have very different reasons that people are migrating from these countries in the first place. And the methodology I used in this study was qualitative interviews. I conducted 79 interviews in Sicily, Rome, and Milan in different parts of Italy with the idea to also understand people's experiences as they came through Italy. So these were retrospective interviews looking at their previous journeys towards Italy. The results that I'll discuss with you are in three core parts. It was leaving their country of origin. The in-between for them, in this case, it was leaving their country of origin and getting to Libya, and surviving and escaping Libya. And I think it's very unsurprising that Libya became a very essential part of their journeys and the experiences that they were facing. So in terms of leaving the country of origin, for Eritreans, this was very difficult at that time. This was against the law, and they were not allowed to leave the country without a valid exit visa. So very, very often they left clandestinely in the night and in the dark, and they would cross on foot to the nearest country of entry. Their leaving was therefore most commonly planned and calculated, and it was done in secret. So they very often did not tell their family members or inform people that they would be doing this. And there was a lot of risk to leaving. If they were caught, then they could easily be arrested and imprisoned. And people told me that they had tried to leave before, and they were then put into prison for a significant period of time, a few years, before they were able to leave the prison, or they were able to escape and able to try again. So there's quite a bit of risk in this very first stage of just leaving the country. For Nigerians, the situation is, of course, very different. Under the ECOWAS agreement, they can freely move to Niger in the north. And therefore, when they left, for some, this was planned. And for some, this was also very unexpected, given the different situations that have been occurring in Nigeria with Boko Haram and terrorism. Some people left very quickly that felt that they were really forced to flee the country. But for others, this was a very planned leaving, and they invested time and resources to decide when they were going to go. So it's quite different situations. Once they left, Eritreans mostly went to Sudan and Ethiopia, and this really depended on where they were in Eritrea, which was the nearest border point. And their stays in these countries were very protracted. So people would often, if they went to Ethiopia first, they would generally go to a refugee camp. And at the refugee camps, they would realize that the situations there were very poor. There's been shortages of food. Hasn't been a right to work. There's been high levels of disease. And in the past, it was very possible for Eritreans to receive a settlement from Ethiopia, but this was no longer the case in recent years. So quite quickly, people realized that there was no opportunity for a sustainable future in Ethiopia. And based on this, they would also go to Sudan, but the situation in Sudan was significantly worsening over the past years as well for Eritrean refugees. People reported many instances of violence and corruption, that they would be approached in the street by the police who would ask to see their papers, and then they would take their papers and tear them up right in front of them. Or other people reported that they were regularly beaten by police if they were seen on the streets. So there was not, again, a very good conditions at all. And because of this, people really didn't feel that they could also stay in Sudan for a long period of time or create a sustainable future there. So the situations were quite complicated then for Eritreans. And I think, as both Heaven and Catherine said in their paper, there was no protection for them in the immediately surrounding countries for having an opportunity for stay for the longer term. For Nigerians, the situation in Niger was more straightforward in the case of the research that I did. There are other studies, I think, that show that the situation is much more complex in Niger. And for them, it was a much shorter movement. And from Niger, they were able to fairly accessibly move towards Libya. It's important to note that when we discuss migration into Libya, is that Libya, at the time when I did this research, so in the times of around 2015, 2016, it was very much controlled by different tribal groups. I think this is still the case today, although the situation has changed a bit with the positions in power. But in Libya, it matters a lot for migrants as to where they enter, as to which tribe covers that territory for the treatment that they receive. So for Eritreans that were entering into the southeast, they were entering into Tibu territory. And the Tibu, I'll explain in a moment what happened to the Eritreans, but this was very different than for the Nigerians who entered into territory that was either often under the Tuareg, or it was unclear and it was a contested territory at different times, taken control by different groups. So for Eritreans, when they entered into the southeast, they were very aware, and they expected and they planned that they would be extorted in Libya. So what happened to them was they would get to the border of Sudan and Libya. They would be told to wait. The kidnappers would come. They would take them to a compound. They would be forced to phone their families. And only after their families had received money would they be released and taken to the north of Libya and pushed to the sea. If their family did not pay the money, then they were capped. There's a lot of instances there of torture, of being beaten, and waiting for the payments to be made. And these were large sums, generally within their averaging at around 6,000 US dollars. So it was a significant amount of money that families needed to send. And in order to do that, they really had to mobilize their transnational network. So families often would only be able to pay this by taking a little bit of money from a family member in Europe and then maybe in Israel. Sometimes they sold their assets in Eritrea to be able to mobilize the money, but it was a very large effort for these families clearly to pay the extortionists and to secure the release of their family member. And I do want to stress again that Eritreans know that this would happen, that this is they were very aware of this, they expected it, and they planned for it. So it's very different than with Nigerians. For Nigerians at the time when I did these interviews, when they were going towards Libya, they very often planned that Libya was their destination, that the time it was still thought that even after the fall of Gaddafi, that there were still opportunities for work, that they could have a potential there to get a job and earn income for their families. So they were often very surprised when they arrived in Libya and found the situation of violence and that there were not the opportunities they were expecting at all. Nigerians had very different situations. Some reported that they experienced being forced into employment, that they experienced being arbitrarily placed into detention, that they also experienced terrorism, or that they were bought and sold by different smuggling networks while in Libya. And the way that they were able to survive was much more through the support of local networks. So sometimes it was local Libyans that were supporting them, and sometimes it was other networks of Africans that supported them as well. And then sometimes it was also situations of chance. Some people, in one case, it was reported that they were held in a compound where they were not allowed to leave, and the bombing happened, and it bombed the compound they were in and destroyed the wall, so they were able to run and escape. So very different situations than that Eritreans entered, which was much more of a systemic situation of kidnapping. Nigerians had very different types of experience that they had in Libya. So sort of coming to the conclusion of what does this mean and what does it say when we see sort of these different and distinct journeys and the routes that people are having. The objective at the beginning of the study was to sort of show what are people's journeys, how do they compare, and to bring forth the idea that these journeys are very distinct as people are traveling towards the same disembarkation point across the central Mediterranean. And the 2 points that I'll just want to make to conclude is that I think that this really highlights further work that's already been done. I think that Heaven and Catherine really said very well, which is the need for protection in countries of neighboring countries of where there's conflict, and that Italy was not necessarily the intended destination. It was the only destination left, which was, I think, said by Vicky Squire and her colleagues in 2017. So this was really the truth for both groups, that were Nigerians planned it on Libya as the destination, and the Eritreans would have stayed in Ethiopia or Sudan if it was possible. There was no options for them. It was really the only place they could go was to Italy. And I think that I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there and not focus so much, I think, on the other elements. But thank you very much then for your attention, and I will pass it back to you, Ozge.
Thanks so much, Katie. This is really an eye-opening research, I would say. So without losing more time, I would like to move to our next presenter. So I'd like to now give the floor to Schapendoek from University of Nijmegen, Mathieu Balai from Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies, and finally Janin Dahindan from So the floor is yours. I look forward to your talk. And in the meantime, I would like to say that please, if you do have any questions, do not hesitate to write them in the chat, and then we'll get back to them.
Thanks to the organizers. Thank you, Eske, for the introduction. I'm indeed representing not only myself, but also Mathieu and Janine. And Mathieu will take over in a minute or so. Our paper is called The Conceptual Limits of the Migration Journey. And today we talk about also some reflections on that paper, but also new analytical openings, maybe. This paper was based on, of course, the emerging field of migration journey research. And in a way, I personally am quite happy with this emerging debate, because it destabilizes indeed binaries of departure, arrival, country of origin, destination, etc. But we also felt, the three of us, that with this new debate, also new questions emerge with this deep destabilization of the binaries. And one of these questions is, and that's the question we take very central in this paper, is on what grounds do we actually separate the so-called migration journey from other types of mobility, from pre- and post-migratory mobilities? And we do this actually in two analytical steps. We take two analytical steps in that particular paper, and we build on the so-called reflexive turn in migration studies, and we review the kind of literature, and we feel that the question of mobility in migration studies is somehow still reduced to the question of the exceptionalized journey. So what is this exceptionalized pace? What makes it exceptional? And this exceptionalization of a journey also reproduces its own analytical pitfalls. One of them is that it considers pre-migratory lives as immobile. The immobile peasant of Ron Skelton and others pops up here. Another pitfall might be that migration only ends when people are settled, when people live immobile lives again. And we question, because we also noticed that a lot of studies talk about when people are included, they start to move again. Joël Moret's work and many others. So it assumes that migration is a phase, or the journey is a phase between the moments of rootedness. Root causes of migration is an easy bridge here, you could say. And we question this rootedness. And we do this in a particular way by linking two different empirical projects, Mathieu's project basically in West Africa, and following the mobility-immobility trajectories of minors, and my own project that focuses on the intra-European mobility of West Africans after they have somehow reached the Eurospace. And we do this with a mobility lens, and I think this is still important to articulate, because I could, for instance, myself have analyzed my stories, my work, my ethnographic work on people's trajectories, still with a terminology of onward migration, of transit migration, as also noted by Catherine and Heaven. But this somehow misses the point of how people position themselves in Eurospace, how mobility is a continued practice as well. So here I will give the floor to Mathieu for a minute, and he can introduce his project a bit further, and then I will talk a bit about mine and how we link the two. Mathieu, where are you?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah, I guess so. So thanks, Joris. Thanks, Holger, for the organization. So yeah, just a few words about my project. So this project focused on what I call expulsion-induced mobilities happening at the bottom of the gold supply chain. And this was my PhD research, which I conducted between 2011 and 2017 under the supervision of Janine, who is also a co-author of this paper. And the leading question of this research was to understand how West African young men used mobility to realize social recognition in a context marked by the pervasive expansion of the mining industry. So not just territorially, but also into all spheres of life. In fact, in the last 10 years, the number of artisanal informal mining sites has exploded through the whole sub-region in Senegal, Upper Guinea, in Mali, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Niger, and so on, across the whole geological Birimian belt. And the number of mining titles and of industrial operation has also boomed, and both sectors are in competition to access the deposit. And in these regions, millions of people, in fact, now work informally in the artisanal gold mines in different degree, and it has become the second source of livelihood after agriculture. This was due, of course, to unemployment, deurbanization, displacement due to conflict in some cases, and mainly, of course, to the rising prices of gold after the financial crisis, and now again with the COVID pandemic. And put very shortly to put the project more in relation with the question of today, the growing titling of the land and the formalization policies have put artisanal miners in this situation of de facto illegality. And so as a result, informal mining sites can appear in a few days and drive thousands of people who can be expelled equally fast. And so I was interested to see how people maintained a mobile lifestyle within this geography, which are extremely ephemeral. And to do so, I used a trajectory approach and mobile methods, meaning that I followed a group of miners in their operation across a region, across several countries, and did so during several years. And this led me to show that despite the exploitative work conditions, they also gained a sense of agency that they felt they were deprived from in their villages, and that they constructed circulatory territories and flexible networks that they continually build and rebuild across borders and social spheres. And paying attention to phase of mobility and immobility and the continuous redirectioning led me to see how borders were strategically used, shifting location according to more or less repressive policies, but also how government and corporate actors often use the migration lexicon to justify expulsion from specific sites, occupied not only by illegal workers, but by non-nationals, in spite of the ECOWAS agreement. And one element which was peripheral but still recurrent among my informants is that some of them had expanded their mobility, sometimes to North Africa, and sometimes also, and some of them had intended to move to Europe and then had come back to the mine. Well, so this was just to give you an idea of the research project at large, and I'm giving the floor back to Joris.
Thank you, Mathieu. And we mirror these mobile territories of Mathieu's project with the mobility trajectories that I followed between 2014 and 2018, basically. And this project was also based on qualitative methods, ethnography, in the sense that I followed a selection of people through time and across space to different places they end up in. And it helped me to unfreeze the positionalities of these Africans that they are often portrayed as living in the margins or living in certain localities, but they through mobility they move in and out of the margins. They move in and out of Europe. They move in and out of certain positions, certain professions as well. And with these empirical insights, I aim to more or less desegregate debates. On the one hand, we have a large and very lively debate on so-called Euro mobility. The Eurostars of Adrien and Favel, of course, needs to be mentioned here. But when we talk about mobility of so-called third country nationals in Europe, we shift the terminology. We shift towards onward migration. We shift towards transit migration. And I found it highly problematic because these mobility projects of the people I worked with were as open, as flexible as the Eurostars of Adrien and Favel. So there are a lot of cross-fertilizations to be made across different forms of movement, perhaps. So a few points of synergy. We felt that mobility is, of course, not footloose in a sense. They are anchored through mobility locality relations, but it is a continual practice across shifting geopolitical settings. There are, of course, political economic structures at play that produce or create forms of movement. In my case, the agricultural season was one of the rhythms that affected a lot of mobility that I've seen. We also discussed the network work, but I leave it for now and shift to the discussion of, are we then talking about a very particular group? Of course, we talk about a highly mobile context. The miner context is characterized by expulsion, precarity, and also in Europe, you could say that there's a lot of uncertainty for the people in question. But there is a lot to explore beyond these settlers versus drifters. So some people would say we are talking about the sojourners or the drifters. But this is missing the point for me, because the local anchorages of my informants, but also how they see themselves in Eurospace, is also a question of belonging, being here, etc. I see some chats popping up, so I will finish soon. What we argue is that also in less mobile context, you could pay more attention to how flexible forms of movement relate to migratory projects. For instance, how tourism visits might induce a migratory move, or how migratory moves end up in different flexible movements across borders. So it's basically an approach that tries to do better justice to the meanings, the politics, but also the transformations, discursive transformations in terms of labels, in terms of meanings, in terms of lived realities that are attached to cross-border mobility. In that sense, it's telling that the first project started with livelihoods and mobility as a kind of framework, and then ended up talking about migration. And my project was embedded in the onward migration discussion, you could say, but I also ended up with circulations and terminology like mobile territories and so on. So this demigrantized approach, which is of course a reference to Janine's work, or mobility approach, is very, I would say, suitable to understand how migration and mobility related terminologies are embodied, experienced, and so on, but at the same time, or different times, contested and transgressed. It helps us to overcome analytical deadlocks, unproductive divides, for instance, Euro mobility versus African onward migration, or as if livelihood mobility is so different from migration, etc. Another, I think, because, I think I need to contextualize this. Özge asked us to not to talk about policy implications, but more about what's the future research of this kind of trajectory research. And one nice empirical angle could be how trajectories of different forms of movement entangle and disentangle in different places. Tourism and labor migrants. Rural to urban migration and flexible forms of movement, etc. And most importantly, maybe we also need to shift the gaze, perhaps, not only to the people themselves who move, but to the regimes that turn specific forms of mobility into migration. And now I give for the final slide the word to Mathieu again.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Joris. So this is just a very brief illustration of this idea just brought by Joris, that how labels can in fact impact and affect trajectories and mobility practices. So if we look here, for example, this is based on the recent exploratory research in Mali just this year before the pandemic started, and it's based on the observation that lots of the new gold rushes in the Sahara in fact overlap what the IOM and what the migration framework put as a transit zone, and that people who work in this area are increasingly also labeled through that. So it comes with border closure, with difficulties for people to move from mine to mine. And on the contrary, if we look at the first slide here, the traditional zone of mining are those who are considered in migration, hence at least in the IOM vocabulary, as a point of departure. And so I started being interested to see how this migration apparatus and the externalization of European borders also has an impact on people's livelihoods, and in fact in a trajectory perspective, lots of people move from mine to mines, and they go to North Africa, come back, and lots and what appeared that lots of people who had been deported from Libya or Algeria ended up in the IOM camps in Niger, and then and then had no other option than to move to the gold mine. So this is just an illustration of how these two types of lands intersect. So yeah, thanks, thank you all, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think it was such a fascinating idea to bring together two different research projects in a paper. I think that's really that was really interesting. So we are running a little bit out of time, but I had taken that into consideration. But last but not least, I would like to now give the floor to Marie Godin from University of Oxford and Georgia Donna from University of East London. This will be our final presentation, and I look forward to it. The floor is yours now.
Yes, so you can hear me, yeah? Yes. Okay, so thank you so much to the editors, Özge, Eric, and Richard, for organizing this webinar and for having put this special issue all together. So the article is co-written with my colleague, Georgia Donna, and it's entitled Rethinking Transit Zone, Migrant Trajectories, and Transnational Networks in Techno Borderscape. Okay. So our paper contributes to the special issue's overall goal of debunking linear approaches to mobility by challenging the concept of transit zone. And we do so by looking at the intersection between mobilities and mobile technologies in the context of migrants' increasingly long, complex, and fragmented trajectories. It is based on a narrative, participatory, and ethnographic research with migrants in transit at the France-UK border between October 2015 and October 2016, as well as ongoing transnational collaborations with a subgroup of former residents. In the context of the so-called migration crisis of 2015 and 16, on one hand, many studies have looked at the use of mobile communication technologies by refugees, not only to belong and connect, but also to survive and navigate. And on the other hand, there is another range of studies that look at how ICTs have come to play a crucial role in the state's management of borders, border controls, and governance of migration. So this article wanted to move beyond this dichotomy that is often found in the literature, so between these top-down digital infrastructures of control and bottom-up refugees' use of device in isolation from other social actors at the border. So we developed the concept of techno borderscape, and that draws from Appadurai notion of the technoscape and Rajaram and Grandivo's concept of borderscape. And it's allowing us to capture different forms of social interaction that take place both online and offline among migrants and other social actors, such as activists, border guards, smugglers, and humanitarian actors. And it also makes it possible to look at the intersection between digital securitization, digital humanitarianism, and digital activism from the perspective of migrants. So these are often treated separately, but also they tend to either reduce migrants as oppressed by these new technologies of borders, or they look at migrants as recipients of aid only, or as passive actors in regard to political activism. So in the paper, we look at how migrants are embedded into this techno borderscape and how they use mobile digital devices to interact, negotiate, interfere with the diverse agenda of various state and non-state actors at the border. And to illustrate this, we discuss how migrants in this highly precarious and securitized space can use mobile phones to putting in place peer-to-peer systems of protection, as well as monitoring, checking on each other when crossing the border, but also in the camp. We also look at how migrants negotiate the use of new technologies in this new landscape of digital humanitarianism. So, for instance, we look at the case of phone credit for refugees and displaced people. For example, that coordinates the distribution of phone top-up to people on the move so that they can contact their families, communicate with support agencies and stay safe. But we also show that migrants become embedded into this techno borderscape, and show that social media platforms such as Facebook has provided opportunities for migrants in transit to organize. So on the right side, you have a screenshot from a Facebook page called Refugee Voice, and which was created by a former resident from Afghanistan who created this page called Refugee Voice 2015 while in the transit camp in order to raise awareness of the conditions and needs of migrants in transit in Calais, but also to amplify the voices of the refugees. And then lastly, we also look at how migrants engage into border struggles and everyday digital forms of what we call border resistance online and offline. And we show how they organize and how they use social media to advocate for change. So what we've been trying to show in the paper is that transit spaces are not just in between spaces, as it has been mentioned before, but they are rather transformative and transforming spaces in which mobile digital technologies play a significant role. And now my colleague, Georgie Dana, is going to carry on.
Yes, so Marie has described our research, and I'm going to outline 3 areas for future research as we were asked to think about. So the first area is the very idea of what a transit space means. And in a way, we are encouraging future research to rethink transit spaces beyond the idea of transit, but also as spaces of destination, places of return, and looking at the legacy that transit may have on future mobilities. So transit implies the idea of passage, and this is the case for most migrants, but not for all. And for some, transit spaces, again, are transformed into something else whose meaning goes beyond the idea of transit per se. So one of the findings of our research, which was slightly unexpected for us, was that even in the context of Calais, some of the residents that we spoke with and had been there, they had been there before. So some of the interviews revealed that some of the people who were in Calais had been there, but they had returned to stay or to set up business. So Calais for them was a business destination. Or they had returned to visit after they had been to Calais as a part of as a volunteer. Or they had returned and through the second kind of or third migratory trajectories after deportation returning to Europe. So we suggest that future research would do well to examine the meaning of transit spaces beyond the connotation of transit along migrants' multidirectional trajectories. And what our long-term collaboration with migrants also outlines is that there is, in a way, quite an emotional and affective legacy that transit has. So through using digital technologies, we managed to keep in touch with a subgroup of migrants. And they told us how they had still strong connections with people who had been in Calais, but also they, again, went back and they participated in activism organized by this international community to support and to rethink the legacy of transit. Next slide, please. So another kind of area that we think would be valuable in terms of thinking about migrants' mobilities and trajectories and transit spaces pertains intersectionality, situated positionality, and what this also tells us about digital inequalities that may shape migrants' journeys. So as we know, migrants in transit are not a homogeneous group. And our research indicated that gender, generations, and nationalities played a role in the experiences of transit life, that were shaped by differential access to mobile technologies. This could be digital literacy, but also the ability to buy credit, etc., etc. And thus we suggest that future research could would do well, and also would develop our initial findings by adopting an intersectional lens to study transit life and digital inequalities in migrant trajectories. And while our research adopted a migrant-centered approach to understanding migrants' interactions in transit spaces, we also would encourage future research to adopt a situated positionality methodology to understanding techno-borderscapes by including the perspectives of other actors involved in the process, such as humanitarian, volunteers, activists, police, and residents of the areas where transit spaces are. Next slide, please. So the last point that pertains future research is around what is the concept that we have developed, that of techno-borderscapes, and how that concept can be maybe brought forward, can be developed more. So the way in which we developed and conceptualized techno-borderscapes is that techno-borderscapes is a concept that allows us to capture online and offline interactions among a range of social actors, and to show that relationships among digital securitization, digital humanitarianism, and digital activism in a way unfold together. So we hope that the idea and concept of techno-borderscapes may be adopted and possibly adapted in other contexts. And we think that there are two kind of sub-directions, or two directions for this, this adaptation. And one is across external borders, and another one is across internal borders. So most of research on, again, migrant trajectories and digital technologies has been conducted in Europe. And we think that there is a scope to think how techno-borderscapes would unfold in other contexts in the global south. And this might unravel how technology and migration intersect with existing colonial systems of control and subjugation through techno-colonialism. That is, again, not being discussed a lot in relation to the intersection between migration and migrant trajectories and technologies. We also suggest that future research could look at techno-borderscapes and their workings inside national borders to examine the role that mobile technologies have in processes that have been described by some of my colleagues at the University of East London, Georgie Wavis, Nira Yuval Davis, as everyday bordering practices that unfold across health sectors, educational sectors, and other sectors, whereby migrants who manage to cross borders encounter new forms of everyday bordering practices, and what is the role of technology in these new forms of everyday kind of bordering practices. Thus, to conclude, we hope that future research, that our research and future research on techno-borderscapes may allow us to understand better and unpack the nexus between migration, borders, and technologies in their unfoldings as forms of control and empowerment, as well as ordering and resistance. Thank you very much for listening.
I think that was an excellent ending to the presentations. Thank you so much. So without waiting for long, I would like to immediately give the floor to Eric to moderate the open discussion session. I see that there are already a couple of questions coming in, so we can...
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I hope you can hear me. But first, I would like to take the opportunity just to thank Aske for organizing this webinar, of course, and to thank all the contributors we heard thus far for the very inspiring presentations. But I would also like to thank them for the cooperation in the past few years, actually, because we worked together since we met in December in late 2017. And I think together we were able to produce this wonderful special issue for GEMS on migration trajectories and transnational support. So thank you very much again. But I would like to give, the floor is open for questions, if you want. I actually do have a question here from someone. Shall we just ask you? This is from Austin. You say you're from Nigeria, but you have a question for Katie. Can you just, because we have actually limited time. Could you just ask your question, if you're still there, of course?
Thank you so much. I think I had typed the question in the chat box, so maybe I can just read it out. And I said I am a Nigerian living in Nigeria, and my
Is Austin still around?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Shall I read the question? So it's about, it's for Katie actually. 2 quick points. God, it's not too easy. Scaling up access to information available to potential return migrant workers as trafficking and smuggling of migrants are largely associated with limited access to information. So the question is to Katie, whether she could give a kind of advice for migrants, potential migrants, more information. And the second point is also for Katie, the reconciliation of practice measures in line with normative content of free movement, the free movement protocol, I think, in Africa. I'm not really sure whether the question is clear to you, Katie. Are you still there, and could you answer this?
I'm still here. Thanks very much, Eric, and thanks, Austin, for the question. Also, I will make an attempt, but maybe some of
I don't hear anything.
Can you hear me? Otherwise,
yes.
Okay. But maybe some of my colleagues also would like to jump in, I think, on the wider scope of the question. So just to clarify, my research was conducted in Italy with Nigerians that arrived in Italy. And this part of the research really just looked at their journeys before leaving Libya. And so just wanted to sort of clarify that point. I think that there is, a large body of work that's being done on information campaigns and making more information.
I don't hear Katie, actually.
I think you're the only one, Eric.
I think there's, sorry, Eric, I think that there's quite a bit of information available on increasing migration information campaigns and efforts to deter people from migrating. And there's some interesting work, I think, that the IOM Global Migration Data Analysis Center has just completed on a review of the effectiveness of different campaigns. But I can't speak to that, I think, from my own research at this time. Perhaps other colleagues can. And I think on the second question regarding the reconciliation of practice measures in line with the normative content of the free movement protocol and other mobility related frameworks, I also don't necessarily think that I can speak to that very well. I will be honest. I think that the mobility frameworks, there have been a lot of contestation, of course, as to how well these have or have not enabled movement within the borders and also when people go beyond them, and that there are still many challenges within them. But my own research has not addressed that point, so maybe one of the colleagues from their research or their other projects can say more about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie, for your response. I don't see any other new reactions, so I will move ahead with the second question that I see here by Richard, who was asking, of course...
Can you take over the discussion? Somehow don't hear anything.
I do, yeah. And so basically the question is a bit of lessons learned from the different types of methodologies that you've used in the field, right? So like we've heard about resource conduct interviews or others that are ethnographic work where you follow the individuals yourself. So, and the question is like, okay, what are the pitfalls? What are the disadvantages? Could you reflect on that? Maybe Joris would like to respond?
Sorry, I missed the last part of that question a little bit. So could you?
So it was basically a question on reflecting on the methodologies that we use in this field, because it's very difficult to follow people on the move, and we tend to use these retrospective reviews. Is it good enough? What shall we do? What's the best?
Following people is also quite weird, I must say. It's really, I always feel a bit uncomfortable also with my own methodology. It creates great friendship, but some papers have mentioned it shadowing or all kinds of language, I felt, this is maybe not going in the right direction, so to say. So my work, and I'm sure also that counts for Mathieu, is it starts with engagement. It starts with a kind of relation from where you can follow. So it's also very self-selective. I could only follow the people that that was a kind of basis, right? Social foundation. But I think it's a very nice addition to the usual interview approach, because the interview setting is that you collect a story at a certain time in a specific place, and that story freezes the image of that particular person. Indeed, it might change a point of transit in a destination, because at that certain point he thought or she thought that this was the place to be, right? So this freezing element of interview techniques, I feel it's quite problematic in this kind of research that we often do. So therefore, I think it's very nice and very insightful to catch up with the people you talked before with too. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Thanks, Joris. Does any one of you would like to reflect on this, perhaps Mari or so?
Yes.
And Heaven, I see her hand. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, in our case, I think it's so as I mentioned, so it's we are combining narrative, ethnographic, and participatory methodologies. And I think it's important to say that our research project was also part of a broader civic engagement project that was led by the University of East London, which kind of organized also a series of written, photographic, and art-based workshop on life narratives. And a lot of quotes that are in the article comes actually from a book that was published called Voices from the Jungle. And in terms of following, so I mean, in our case, and I think Georgia maybe may want to add something, like we didn't follow people after they left they left Calais, but we continue collaborating with them on other research projects. So it's more like a conversation that is also ongoing, and some of the pictures also that we that are used in the presentation. When we use them, we often go back to the people that we are still in touch with, and we tell them what we are doing with them. So they have some form of copyright as well of the pictures that we use in our work. So yeah, Georgia, I don't know if you want to add something.
You've covered it, yes. The only point is that it's this kind of ongoing reflection together with a group of former migrants that is highlighting the whole idea of the legacy of the transit space for us that we would have not become aware of had we just interviewed them when they were in Calais. Because many of them returned as volunteers, they kept connections with those who stayed in France, etc., etc. So that in a way, using digital, I suppose that the point about our research is also that we used Facebook, WhatsApp messages. So we use digital methodologies, one could say, as a way of, again, research in the digital, in a networked society.
Yeah, that's really nice. Thank you, Georgia. Can I give the floor to Heaven now?
Yeah, I don't have much to add in the sense that I think this is a really complicated question, and it could be a whole seminar of its own, right? Because all of our different methodological approaches invariably raise different kinds of issues in relation to the snapshot issues that Joris was talking about, or the issues, the kind of ethical issues of maintaining relationships. Certainly the people we talked to, we didn't try to collect contact information from people precisely because they were at a point in their journey where we felt that there were really serious ethical implications of talking to people immediately on arrival and then expecting to get contact information to maintain that relationship with them over time. So I think in every context, at every point, there are different consequences. I think I don't think there's enough reflection on that. I think you often have work that's written on the kind of findings of various different approaches, which rarely reflects on, or often doesn't reflect on, what the implications of the methodology itself are for the kinds of narratives that are gathered. And I think we, and Catherine might want to add on this, I mean, I think we retrospectively have all sorts of regrets, for want of a better word, about what we did and didn't ask, how we did and didn't ask it, because much of what we kind of concluded was a consequence of some of those experiences of doing the research at that point in very difficult circumstances, and then retrospectively thinking, well, actually, if we were asked some questions about this, and then that moment has passed. So I think the really important thing is to reflect on how the methodology shapes both the narratives that people give you, because you get narratives depending on the questions that you ask, and then how we ourselves as researchers then narrate it, sometimes presenting it as if it's some sort of truth that's just been kind of gathered up and presented, when of course everything about this process, this research process, is contingent on how we want to frame the questions, ask the questions, represent the questions, represent ourselves in relation to the question and in relation to others. So I think some honesty about that would give more integrity to the findings, if nothing else. But I think the question's a very good one, because it raises so many different issues about not just what's the best method, because there isn't one, but what the consequences of each method are for the kinds of stories that we gather and present to others.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable what you've said also regarding the transparency of our way of work, basically, and being honest to ourselves as well. Yeah, that's great. I also see some comments in the chat, but they're not so much of questions, but again, like reinforcing the idea that we need to think about the ethics of collecting data and what it means when we do research on migration trajectories. I think at this point, and we've now already talked about artistic performance, etc., I think I'm going to link this point also to our final guest for today, so Emile Mertens. I hope you all had a chance to watch his movie, and I'd like to really just invite Emile to tell us a little bit more about his movie and perhaps reflect on, you know, what was the main message for you, what did it mean, and now that we've discussed, you know, these issues on migration trajectories and transnational sport, and you look at it from a more of a return perspective, right? So like experiences of someone who is back and all the emotional stress that comes from it. So it would be really nice to hear from you about what you thought about it.
Yeah, well, first of all, good evening, and thank you all for being here. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, and thanks for having me, and particularly for having the film. I've seen that quite a few people have already watched it, about 25 to 30. But I just want to stress that the film is still available until tomorrow. So tomorrow, the whole day, you can still watch the film for free. And I'm very happy to hear your thoughts afterwards if you want to do so. So the film Gifts from Babylon is a short narrative of 24 minutes that came out of an earlier project that we made, which was Welcome to the Smiling Coast. And Welcome to the Smiling Coast was a feature-length documentary that was made by the Gambian media production house State of Mike, by the Dutch filmmaker Bas Akkerman, and I was then involved in the film project as a producer and a story editor. And that film was about, from a critical post-colonial perspective, on tourism, on development and migration in and from the Gambia. And the film largely revolved on tourism, which is a different kind of flow than the migration flow. But we interviewed for that film about 15 workers, tourism workers, who were either formally or informally employed within the tourism sector. And the last part of that documentary really came about migration, because the people that we interviewed often ask themselves the question, should we stay and should we maintain working in the tourism industry or in the margins of the tourism industry, or should we go, and should we also make the irregular crossing through Europe, or try to attempt it, as they had seen many friends or relatives doing that, and sometimes successfully doing so. So the second film that we made, again with State of Mike, the media production center led by Alaji Manka and Babakar Manka, and Dutch filmmaker Bas Akkerman, we decided to make a short narrative on migration and return migration, and to provide a human face to that, and also to show the psychological impact that migration could have on the people undertaking the journey. So we started to develop a script based on stories that we gathered from the Gambian youngsters that we worked with. So the script was written by the people from the state of Mike together with us. And it was kind of a collection or a combining of all kinds of stories that we heard into one narrative, and we opted for the narrative as a genre, so for a fictional format, because we thought we could better capture the kind of emotional trajectory or the emotional experience of the main character through flashbacks and through all kinds of triggers that we could visualize, and also with audio give form. So the film got some funding from the Human Rights Film Festival in the Netherlands. How's it called again? Well, the film festival in The Hague, and we got some crowdfunding help. So with CineCrowd, we started a crowdfunding campaign, and with about $15,000 we went to, or euro, we went to the Gambia to make the film. And eventually it was premiered at the Netherlands Film Festival in 2018, and it was also premiered in North America, the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles, and since then it has screened in over 60 film festivals, also many of them on the African continent. It was also taken up by IOM, the Gambia and West Africa, and it screened there in the Gambia in various communities, universities, high schools, and actually a few days ago the IOM Migration Film Festival started again, and they have again selected our film for their West African selection. So we're quite happy with the exposure that it has received, and I hope that you will probably enjoy is not the right word, but maybe for lack of a better word, enjoyed the film, and I'm interested in hearing your questions and comments.
Can I ask you first question? So there's something that we were discussing this with my colleague Lara Kletten, who really wanted to be there and also have the conversation with you. And she, for example, works on return migration herself. And I was wondering, like, after having listened to all these discussions on like the circularity of movement and the continuity of migration flows within the lives of individuals, would you see what you've done as the endpoint? You know, like how to reflect on the experiences of
Oh, well, you're breaking up a little bit.
Now, I was asking, so basically, you know, you are treating the issue of return migration, right, and the experiences of a returnee, but I think all the discussions we had now refers a lot to the circularity of movement within one's life, right? So how do you think about that now that we have this a bit more of a critical approach to, you know, not seeing return as the end of the migration trajectory?
Well, I don't think that the idea of the film was to portray return migration as the end of the journey. It was one moment within a particular journey from a particular person. Originally, the film wanted to portray the full journey that the character was making. So from first rural Gambia to urban Gambia, then to North Africa, then to Europe, and then back. But here we eventually decided to only film the film in Gambia and to focus on return migration, because we thought that that was also oftentimes an ignored part within migration. Also that a lot of Gambians who are attempting or starting the journey, they so often strand in different countries in Africa and then eventually return. Also when the new president came into power, Barrow, he also started with specific programs to get migrants back. And there was a lot of complaints about how that reintegration in society went. So we also wanted to focus on that. So yeah, it is somewhat represented as a circular journey because he went and he came back at the same place. But it is one specific moment in his life. So we didn't want to portray it as that was the end or something of the journey.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? I see yours unmuted.
Yeah. I was happy to see the film this afternoon, Emile. I wrote you a message, and it's I think a very insightful portrait of a very sensitive and delicate issue. I think what to me stands out of the film is that it totally breaks the myth of that people don't know the risks, that people should be informed about the risks. I think people talk about this, and I also noticed this in the time I was there myself. It's not something that information campaigns or something like this can reduce or something like this. No, it's in that sense, I think to me that's what the film underlined in a way. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that was also something that really came out of both the conversations that we already had for the documentary and that are in the documentary, as well as the conversations that we had in preparation of the film. Indeed, that they were aware of the risk, and even while being aware, they were willing or wanting to take the journey. So that was indeed something that we wanted to have in the film, that there is this awareness and that they are well aware. And also one of the scenes in the film that a friend or a former friend of the protagonist is actually following him on Instagram. So he's following different people who are taking different journeys, and they're aware of that. Although they do create a particular image, that was the argument in the film as well. But indeed, they're very much aware, and that's also what we want to show. Yeah.
Yeah, very good point. Very interesting indeed. I think it's interesting to come back to this, like information campaigns and what it means. Indeed, like people take the chance to move where they want to, even though, yeah, they know the risks, right? Like, so that's really interesting. Yeah, are there any other questions? So I do see one to the panel. So I was wondering what. Oh yeah, this is a question for the panelists actually, and there's a question that is called failed return. I wonder first if Emile agrees with the term. What does it mean, failed return? If you reflect on the, say, the psychosocial consequences of the return, or what would you say about it? Like, do you like the term? What's your first reaction to it?
Well, I think I would need a little bit more context from Elia what that idea of a failed return would entail. But maybe if you look at it from a political or political economic point of view, oftentimes maybe the reintegration of returned migrants is seen as a failed political trajectory. That is maybe one perspective that you can have on a failed return. And the other one is a more psychological or social perspective that you can have, that in this particular instance, the protagonist is not able to settle in with his friends and his family, mainly because of the trauma that he has captured, but also because the ideas that he has taken up from his period that he was away. So in that sense, up till the moment maybe that he is accepting the water that his former girlfriend is giving him, may be seen as a failed return, or at least his parents and his relatives seen it as a failed return. But I'm not sure if this is the context that Helia means.
And yeah, thank you so much for Emile for your response. Ada said that she considers herself a failed return, and it's a question of gender, class, and politics in a way. So there's one question on remittances, and Marta also highlights us get back to that question. It's interesting. So I will just, as a final question, because we're really coming to the end of our meeting, but I'll take Laura's question, who asks, I was wondering whether in your research the sending money home is covered, and has the trajectory of funds been mapped anywhere? I'm aware of support system in Istanbul to which migrants would turn to. So is there anyone who would reflect on the question of remittances in their research? And on that question, maybe we can conclude.
Maybe I can just say a few words around the fact that with, again, these transnational networks that we we are researching, the concept of remittances only being back home might be, again, limited, because we've noticed in our research that the migrants who were in Calais, for instance, they were receiving support from, again, all their families across the diaspora, while at the same time, the families were also helping those back home. And that, in a way, mobile technologies were also becoming a form of remittance itself. So that it wasn't money that was sent, because in Calais people couldn't access a bank, couldn't access money. But what the form of remittance that was sent was maybe a credit card or a phone. And that was, again, but I think that the point is that it's much more kind of circular and dynamic than just the home country.
Thank you. Actually, I myself am working on a paper that looks at the remittances behavior along the journeys of migrants. So looking at Senegalese and Congolese migrants coming to Europe. So when the book chapter is out, I'd be happy to promote it and share it with you. I think that also shows how much, you know, there's the reverse remittances that we focus on when people are on the move, but at the same time that that's still the expectation that you should send also puts a lot of pressure, so to say, on the people on the move, and that's something that we try to do in that. Yeah, so I think it's time for us to conclude. I would like to thank everyone for their attention, their participation, engagement. I think this was very fruitful and interesting. I'm also really glad that we will be able to post this webinar for those who weren't able to stay till the end. Yeah, so I'd like to conclude here and wish you all a very nice evening. And yeah, so we can end the session now, I believe. Thank you so much.